Professor Sine's model suggests that by 2026, a military defeat by Iran could leave your bank account balance as useful as scrap paper. This isn't a fringe conspiracy, but a projection from a game theorist whose previous forecasts on the American presidency have already materialized. Public perception of military strength is often tied to the size of a nation's budget. However, the hardware currently dictating the terms of the Middle East conflict follows a logic that bypasses traditional American air and sea power entirely. The United States military remains structured around Cold War doctrines, prioritizing high-cost, multi-purpose systems designed for large-scale conventional battles. This focus on muscle flexing creates a massive technological overhead that is difficult to pivot toward modern, low-cost threats. As a result, the U.S. is attempting to win a 21st-century asymmetric war using 20th-century logic. They are not necessarily being defeated in physical combat. They are being structurally bled dry. The American Navy centers its power on the Aircraft Carrier Strike Group, a single hull carrying billions of dollars in specialized aviation technology. This massive concentration of capital is the cornerstone of how the U.S. projects influence across the globe. Contrast that with the Iranian Shahed 136 drone. It uses a basic two-stroke piston engine to fly 2,000 kilometers on just 100 liters of fuel. It is simple, difficult to track on radar, and costs roughly $50,000 to build. To stop one of these drones, the U.S. typically fires a Patriot or SM-2 interceptor missile. A single interceptor costs several million dollars, requiring a complex industrial supply chain to manufacture and deploy. When your defensive response costs 100 times more than the enemy's attack, winning a war of attrition becomes mathematically impossible. Eventually, you run out of missiles or the money to buy them. Iran has spent the last 2 decades studying American combat vulnerabilities. Rather than trying to match the U.S. in a head-to-head naval engagement, they have developed a strategy of indirect confrontation. This strategy utilizes a decentralized network of proxy groups, including the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas. These groups act as regional force multipliers, allowing Iran to strike without deploying its own standing army. These groups are not prioritizing American soldiers as their primary targets. Instead, they are aiming at the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. Iran's objective is to bypass the American military entirely and strike the specific nations that provide the economic support for the U.S. dollar's global dominance. Despite their immense oil wealth, the Gulf states lack one essential natural resource: drinking water. They survive by processing salt from the sea through massive desalination plants. These industrial facilities provide over 60% of the water supply for cities like Riyadh and Dubai. If a single $50,000 drone reaches a primary water plant in Riyadh, the supply for 10 million people is cut instantly. Without that infrastructure, the city has exactly 14 days before its reservoirs are dry. It is a crisis that cannot be solved with an aircraft carrier or an airstrike. Simultaneously, Iran can block the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is the entry point for 90% of the food and grain imported into the region. By targeting water and food rather than military bases, Iran creates an immediate existential threat to the survival of the Gulf states, using only a fraction of their military budget. This infrastructure crisis connects directly to the U.S. through the petrodollar system. By selling oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, the Gulf states ensure that the dollar remains the world's reserve currency. These nations then reinvest that money back into the United States, purchasing billions in American real estate and stocks every year. Currently, this influx of Gulf capital is a primary driver of the American tech sector. Massive investments from Saudi Arabia and the UAE are fueling the build-out of the global artificial intelligence infrastructure. If Gulf infrastructure is destroyed, their oil exports stop and their domestic economies halt. The investment capital required to maintain American AI data centers and tech valuations would evaporate overnight. A strike on a desalination plant in the desert acts as a physical detonator for the American stock market. The collapse of Gulf infrastructure leads directly to a crash in the U.S. tech economy. Neutralizing this threat would require a full-scale ground invasion for regime change. Despite the risks to the global economy, American military leadership has stated they have no current intention of deploying ground troops to Iran. However, the U.S. presidency faces immense pressure from lobbying groups and financial backers with deep ties to Gulf investment. This pressure often pushes executive policy toward conflict, even when the military math does not support a victory. In modern warfare, the world's largest military can be defeated without a single shot being fired at its borders. You simply have to find the cheapest thread in the economic fabric and pull until the system begins to unravel.